Overwatch 2 was supposed to mark the start of a new era for the series, with a chance to explore the stories behind some of gaming's most iconic characters in new ways and build on everything that had seen Overwatch grow into one of the largest games in the world. Backed by a passionate community whose artists and authors had supported Overwatch in the years that Blizzard had abandoned it to work on the sequel. Unfortunately, that Overwatch 2 hasn't been released yet, and honestly may not ever, with scandals, broken promises, an angry community, and a launch that's remembered more for its monetization than anything else. So what happened to Overwatch 2? Well, it all starts back in 2019, with then Overwatch director Jeff Kaplan telling the world that he wanted to make a single player experience that could bring Overwatch's colourful cast of characters to a whole new group of people that didn't want to play a competitive first-person shooter, but still wanted to connect to the franchise. And that desire could finally happen in a sequel, while giving a big free multiplayer update for current players. On the surface, this was honestly really exciting. In such a short period of time, Overwatch had risen to compete with some of gaming's titans, and was now planning to be the first to expand out its cinematic world, which had already shown a lot of potential just from the reactions to Overwatch's cinematic trailers. And while there wasn't a whole lot of information on what the single player mode would look like, beyond its co-op missions, the chance to explore the world was enough to get basically everyone hyped. But for Blizzard, this would come at a cost. All of these features needed a lot of developer time, so much so that development for Overwatch 1 would need to slow down, which does make sense, and back in 2019 didn't seem like such a big deal. After all, Overwatch was one of the biggest games on the planet, with a massive player base, premium price tag, and multi-million-dollar esports scene behind it. So surely slower updates wouldn't mean Blizzard completely stop adding content, right? Unfortunately for Blizzard, and more importantly the community, things were about to get bad. Really bad. After a year of basically silence over the state of Overwatch 2, Jeff Kaplan, the studio face of the franchise, announced he was leaving Blizzard after 19 years. And as the community reacted both in shock and some hopefulness over both him leaving and the state of Overwatch 2, another devastating report came through. Activision Blizzard were now under a string of lawsuits over toxic workplace practices that would lead to large-scale changes both inside the studio and from sponsors of the Overwatch League, which at the time had also begun to show signs of collapsing as people lost interest in a premium game that barely received any content changes, while the lockdown had seen other free-to-play games receive major overhauls and changes, not to mention the rise of new competitors like Riot's Valorant and the rise of the Battle Royale. And behind all of this chaos were changes that would later have a large impact on the future of Overwatch 2. The announcement that the game's multiplayer was going free to play, and regulation changes over loot boxes including a potential ban on them, meant Overwatch 2 would probably not have them. Now at the time this didn't seem like such a big deal, but they were the first real signs of the changes Overwatch 2 was showing. Aside from the loss of its old figureheads, Overwatch was no longer a premium catch in a sea of free-to-play microtransaction-infested games, and that, along with its move to 5v5, meant the game was losing a lot of its, well, character. Though the full scope of these changes wouldn't be felt until the game's early access launch later on, which was also a little strange with Blizzard now saying the game would be split up into two parts, with the multiplayer mode coming first and the single player mode coming later, which Blizzard said would let them make sure they were able to provide updates faster than before. Overwatch 2 finally arrived in early access at the end of 2022, and reviews were, well, just about what you'd expect from a AAA release from a major studio, basically boiling down to, this game has terrible monetization and doesn't live up to expectations, but the multiplayer is still as good as it was, so it's a 9 out of 10. As for the single player mode, well, it wasn't coming soon, but they promised to talk more about it in 2023. Not exactly a great launch impression outside of the gameplay, but really Overwatch 2's biggest problem, outside of a few bugs and server problems, was just how similar it felt to the first game. For as much new content as Blizzard added, alongside the improvements to the queue times, it was hard not to just see as much missing, with some modes, maps and events gone. But by far the biggest change was to the game's completely revamped monetization system, built from the ground up to be able to compete with free-to-play live service competitors. Now it's pretty clear why Blizzard needed to do this. Loot boxes were a no-go, and Overwatch was an expensive game compared to free-to-play competition, and this meant that a lot of people just wouldn't give the game a chance. But they couldn't have done it any worse. Locking characters behind a battle pass paywall that took weeks to grind, and removing basically any way of earning cosmetics without paying for them doesn't exactly give everyone the best first impression, especially for most people like me who are returning fans of the previous game. And as far as headline features go, outside of the Battle Pass, the game had new graphics, balance changes, character interactions and characters. But for most people in the community, none of this really felt like it was enough to justify a sequel. I mean, could Blizzard have not just updated Overwatch all this time with most, if not all of this? Why was Overwatch shut down and moved over here, just to give the same experience with slight changes? Had even half of this come during the past 3 years, maybe so much of the negativity that surrounded Overwatch could have been avoided. Still, if the single player mode lived up to the hype, maybe it would all be worth it, right? Well, in May 2023, after months of Blizzard's empty statements and future promises, an official announcement was finally made. Overwatch 2's single player hero mode was officially cancelled, and with it months, heck years of pent up frustration that had been bubbling up in the community finally exploded. Honestly, even showing some of these posts doesn't really do it justice, and it's hard to really describe just how bad the news was. Blizzard had not only lied to the community for months, years even, but the whole release was now just a monetization update. To make matters worse, there was no way to even play the original game, with Overwatch 2 replacing it entirely. Following on from the outcry from the community, Blizzard did announce that some single player content was still coming, as part of the Invasion update, though this would be very different to the PvE announcement of before. Blizzard did say they were still committed to telling stories in Overwatch's world, though it didn't really matter since the Steam release was much more interesting to everyone. It was the first Blizzard title in basically forever to make the move, and questions were being asked as to why Blizzard were doing it, and if it was because of an earnings call that mentioned the game losing its player base. In the meantime though, more bad news was in order for Overwatch 2, this time for its Esports League. Now this topic could and probably should be its own video, but to give a quick summary, Blizzard pumped millions into Overwatch's Esports League to artificially grow it with franchising and all, and this started well, and then basically collapsed for a bunch of reasons, including balance, players, viewership and the arrival of Valorant. But with the internal allegations going on at the studio, sponsors had pulled out, and with a lack of updates and somewhat chaotic viewing experience, players had pulled out too. So it seemed pretty clear that the league was basically done. And in July, Blizzard all but confirmed this by laying off its esports staff and offering partner teams $6 million not to return, which seems like a lot, but keep in mind a franchise slot went for something like $20 million back in 2018, not to mention the costs of running the teams themselves. Now for most people this was expected and honestly even good news, since it meant the grassroots scene could grow on its own. And if you needed proof, just take a look at Street Fighter 6's recent open tournament that averaged almost 100,000 viewers. But for some, especially those like me who are around to experience that first year of the league, it's a disappointing end to something that really did promise a lot. Just another broken promise that was becoming all too familiar. Even the launch of Overwatch 2 to Steam didn't do a lot to change much, as on August the 10th, alongside the game's new update and story missions, it peaked with a player count just outside the top 20. And unlike early access, there was no botched launch this time either. But it didn't really matter, as the pent-up frustration from the community worldwide was finally felt, as Overwatch 2 became the worst rated game on Steam ever. And while Blizzard have been quick to respond of the review bombing, it's hard to trust them, especially given the state of the new story missions, which didn't do much to inspire. In fact, they've just made it worse, with the general belief being that while fun, the missions are overpriced, repetitive, and have no replay value. In the end, Overwatch 2's story was basically doomed to a bad start, given just how badly Blizzard had screwed things up at the end of Overwatch, abandoning the series at a time when it was at its peak. And this, mixed with internal chaos and anti-consumer microtransaction changes, haven't exactly left a happy community. Honestly, they might have just been better saying nothing, like the past few years with how things turned out. And I do wonder if Blizzard did a bit of carrot and stick with the community, hiding the microtransactions and battle pass changes behind the promise of a single player mode, only to announce its cancellation once the anger had settled down. In a way, chasing the free-to-play crowd, Overwatch 2 lost a lot of what made it stand out. That said, the game's core multiplayer experience is still as strong as ever, with faster queue times, better balance, and less general chaos going on. The new characters are okay, but the tank change is the most interesting for me. Playing tank is actually stupidly fun now, and you get that raid boss feeling. but the lack of a second tank and the buffs that this role got means that having a bad tank is now an auto lose. The game now actually gets updates, and Blizzard have promised to continue to support the game going forward. Not that their promises mean much. Yet while the loss of the single player mode hurts, in many ways it's the success of Overwatch's competition that hurts more. With most already having their own cinematic experiences through shows and spin-off titles, while Overwatch continues to be carried by its community and a handful of awesome cinematic trailers, in some ways Overwatch could have and probably should have been right in there with them, or at the very least had something to compete with, because as good as the multiplayer is, gaming has changed a lot since Overwatch first came out, and it's the characters that continue to be the game's biggest feature, with their stories driving the community's artists and authors, and that's not something any competitor can be, though Riot are doing a pretty good job of trying all the same. It just sucks to know Blizzard haven't used them to tell any interesting stories. If anything, the story of Overwatch 2 so far really shows just how special of a game Overwatch 1 was, casting a brilliant shadow over everything that came after it, including, for now at least, its own sequel.